Hello to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I would like to give my special thanks to Eva and Nina for making this virtual conference possible so that we can still exchange our thoughts despite the difficult situation. I would like to tell you now a bit about my work with piano roll recordings from the early 20th century. I use these roll recordings a lot in my own research on piano playing and musical interpretation in the late 19th and early 20th century. I have more and more realized that working with them needs a methodology rather different from that of dealing with early acoustic recordings. I'm working at the University of the Arts in Bern, and my university has a rather long tradition of research projects related to piano and organ rolls. A milestone in this research certainly was that we were able to develop and construct a scanner to digitize rolls of various formats. As this conference is focused mainly on early sound recordings, my idea was to speak a bit about what we can hear when we listen to piano rolls, what makes up their sound or sonic reality, and how this is different from a sound recording. And as a starting point, it's important to establish a very simple but important premise that a piano roll is simply not a sound recording, even though we are often tempted to treat it as one when we listen to CD releases of piano rolls or to rolls put on YouTube by owners of reproducing pianos. And while the recording systems for piano rolls could record the timing of notes with astonishing accuracy and therefore provide a very reliable picture of the performances in respect to tempo, rhythm, and agogics, they had only very limited means of capturing the aspects that decide the sound of a performance. A comparison of different LP and CD releases of the same roll makes it immediately obvious that the different playbacks of the same roll can sound utterly different. Here are some commercial releases of a roll recorded by Edvard Grieg with one of his own piano pieces. The first one dates from 1930, and it's the earliest sound recording of a Welte piano playing a roll. And this is probably also showing the best possible condition a Welte instrument can be in, as the recording was supervised by the chief technician of the Welte company. In comparison, here is a recording of the same roll from the 1950s. And another more recent one. If you're used to listen to the aspects of the performance that the roll could capture accurately, you will be able to recognize that all these recordings were playing the same role. However, if you focus more on things like the sound of the piano, the dynamic subtleties, or the recording setup, you might have as easily thought of them as different interpretations of the Greek piece. The sound of the piano used to play the role, and even more its condition, how accurately it is able to execute the perforated coating on the roll and how subtle it can reproduce the dynamics, has a huge influence on how the roll sounds. And these differences in sound also change our perception of those aspects of the interpretation which were recorded faithfully by the roll and stayed the same in all these recordings. To avoid making wrong statements about roll recordings based on unsatisfying reproductions due to badly regulated instruments, I usually analyze the rolls with the help of a lot of technology. First, I use a scanner to make digital images of rolls, and this scanning software can then read the perforations on the roll and create something similar to a MIDI file. In this file, all perforations on the roll are simply transformed into MIDI events. The green events in the middle represent the musical notes on the roll. The other colors at the top and bottom of the roll represent the perforations that control the expression system of the instrument and therefore recreate the dynamics of the performance. In a further step, it is possible to run this raw MIDI file through an emulator that converts the expression coding into MIDI velocity values so that each MIDI note receives its individual loudness. No one has gone further and reached better results in emulating reproducing piano rolls than Peter Phillips in Sydney, and the MIDI velocity values in his files perfectly represent how the expression system of a perfectly regulated reproducing piano would operate when playing the roll. These files can be played either on a modern digital reproducing piano like the Disklavier by Yamaha or on virtual piano softwares. I like very much to use Pianotech, which gives me the opportunity to play the files with the sound of an instrument from around 1900, fitting well to the performances of the rolls. However, even the best and most reliable emulated versions of a roll cannot make the roll sound better than what the dynamic coding on it is providing us with. Also, as much as I try to base my analyses of the rolls on measurements and empirical data from the scans, I still can't imagine how listening to the roll could be completely excluded from this analytic process. And knowing how much the sound of the recording influences the perception of the interpretation on the roll, I want to know as much as possible about what the dynamics on the roll can still tell me about how the sound of the original performance was. With two very different examples from roll recordings by the pianist Karl Reinike, I would like to demonstrate briefly how I tried to go even one step further than emulating and to deduce and imagine even more about the performance, about how the performance might have sounded when the pianist was playing at the Roll Company's recording studio. In case of Reinike, who was the oldest pianist whose playing was ever recorded, this is particularly important as he didn't make any sound recordings at all, from which we could get an impression of how his playing sounded. Also, Reinike recorded for two different roll companies, which need to be dealt with in very specific ways. I would like to start with a recording of Schumann's fantasy piece Warum, which Reinike recorded for the Welte Mignon reproducing piano. The Welte Mignon was the first fully reproducing piano that was introduced in 1905. It plays fully automatically and it tries to reproduce the performances of the pianists as closely as possible, with quite some success. The dynamic coding on the Welte roll is complex, and although we know barely anything about the recording process, it is safe to assume that Welte had a rather reliable way of recording the dynamics of a performance automatically. Probably even the process to convert the recorded dynamics into coding for the roll was at least partially automated. In case of the Reinike roll, I started by looking at the dynamics through the emulated MIDI file by Peter Phillips and tried to evaluate how convincing they seem, looking for evidence that would suggest that at least part of what the coding conveys was based on how Reinike actually shaped the dynamics. And I could find some evidence for that in the melody line. Here you can see the velocity values of the first couple of melody notes. For such a generally soft piece, they seem to have a reasonable dynamic range, between 45 and 64, and almost no two succeeding notes are played at the same levels. In addition, when comparing the dynamics with the dynamic indications in the score, there are some obvious differences. Especially at the end of phrases where Reinike often shows clear decrescendos, while Schumann wrote hairpin crescendos in the score. The decrescendo rendition is, at least to me, musically convincing and very charming. However, it is such a personal way of shaping these lines that I find it hard to imagine that some technical editor at Welte would come up with this solution. So it seems likely that Reinike indeed played it like that, and the Welte system was able to record it. However, the accompanying chords in the same recording show a very different picture. Almost all chords are being played with identical loudness. And this goes against everything we know about how carefully Reinike and other pianists from the German academic tradition wanted the accompaniment and inner voices to be treated. Also, even if that would have been desired, it would almost be possible to play all these notes at exactly the same loudness. So, the dynamics provided by the roll are clearly an oversimplification. I don't have a definite answer for why this happened, but I could imagine that below a certain threshold, either the recording device could no longer recognize any differences in softness, or the expression system could not reproduce them, and they were therefore not coded onto the roll. Realizing that the dynamics of the melody appeared to convey something of Reinike's original performance, and I then tried to slightly adjust the velocity values of the accompaniment to make it a better and more subtle match to the melody, without changing anything of the dynamics in the melody. The improvements are very small, and you might not even recognize the differences without listening to them in comparison a couple of times. But I didn't want to go any further than this so that I would not risk to impose too much of my own taste onto Reinike's recording. However, I believe that these slight changes do make a difference and can help to make Reinike's interpretation sound even more convincing. And well, while there is no way of knowing if this is really how he played, it at least does not violate the aesthetics of late 19th century piano playing. And I would like to play for you first the original version, just the emulated version of the original roll. And then my improved version with slightly more nuanced accompanying chords. Reinike recorded an even larger repertoire for the German Hupfeld company, and while his interpretations on these rolls are highly fascinating, the Hupfeld rolls pose a much greater methodological challenge than the Welte rolls. While Welte focused entirely on making rolls for their reproducing pianos, Hupfeld sold the majority of their rolls for foot-pedaled player pianos similar to the American pianola. Caught by surprise, when Welte published the Mignon system, within only a few months Hupfeld started to record their own artist rolls. However, their first reproducing piano, the Dea, was not ready yet. And so they first published all these recordings in versions for their foot-pedaled phonola, and some even never were released on reproducing rolls. The player piano rolls, however, contain no information on the original dynamics whatsoever. A skilled pianola player can of course perform these rolls in a fully convincing way, but it is then his personal choice how to shape the dynamics. And as I am not a professional pianola player, this was not an option for me. Rather, I tried a different approach to give back some life to these rolls. I decided to try to play the piece myself, imitating those parts of Reinike's interpretation which are accurately recorded on the roll, as closely as possible. My hope was that a close understanding and even embodying of how Reinike shapes time and rhythm of the piece would naturally lead me to a dynamic rendition of it that would at least be in style with Reinike. So I analyzed the recording in great detail, measuring its timing, rhythm, arpeggiation, and I was looking for some descriptions in historical sources about how dynamics and agogics of an interpretation were linked to each other, hoping to find at least some hints on how to deduce one from the other. Here is an example of what I found. Adolf Karpe, a student of Reinike, published several books on musical interpretation, focusing especially on rhythm, phrasing, and accentuation. For him and Reinike, It was very important that the time signature or meter of a piece would always be perceivable through the so-called metrical accent, even where notes falling on weak beats would receive a stronger rhythmical or pathetic accent. Karpe explains how in such cases, for example in syncopations, the stronger rhythmical accent would be realized through loudness, whereas the metrical accent would be realized by lengthening the first beat of the bar. In the Andante from Beethoven's Sonata Opus 28, which Reinike recorded for Hupfeld, there is a passage very similar to the examples shown by Karpe. So I wanted to find out if Reinike's playing matches Karpe's instructions. I thought that the seemingly regular pulse of the 16th notes in the left hand would be a good starting point for measuring Reinike's timing. However, the result seemed to reveal the exact opposite of what Karpe was describing. The second eighth note beats, on which the syncopated sforzato chord falls, is lengthened significantly each time. And when listening just to the repeating A's in the left hand, there's absolutely no way of recognizing where the downbeats are. However, all these sforzato chords are also heavily arpeggiated, and the distorted rhythm of the 16th notes suggests that all these arpeggios start before the beat, therefore lengthening all the second beats when only measuring the bass line. If instead I measure the timing mostly in the melody, taking measurements from the bass only on beats where there is no note in the melody, indeed all the downbeats end up being slightly longer than the following beat with the sforzato chord. So while it is possible to say that in agreement with Karpe, Reinike gives metrical accents to the downbeats by slightly lengthening them, and we can safely assume that he realized the rhythmic accent on the syncopation by playing it louder, the perception of the passage is as much shaped by a third kind of accent not described by Karpe, an accent through arpeggiation on the syncopated chords. The challenge for me, while adding dynamics to Reinike's interpretation through my own reenactment of it, was now to balance these three accents in a convincing way, so that the rhythmical accent on the syncopations would not be so strong as to completely obscure the metrical accent and the orientation within the bar. To conclude my presentation, I would now like to play to you an excerpt of my reenactment of Reinike's role, which is, however, still very much a work in progress, and I'm still constantly trying to improve my understanding of Reinike's performance. Thank you very much.